die goldene Paare geflogen, geflogen. Und die Nacht hat geöffnet.
My paternal grandparents died when I was in my early teens. As I got older, I learned more about how they left their homeland and traveled thousands of miles to a new and foreign land. Unfortunately, never had the opportunity to ask them about their life in Russia, what their childhood was like, and the names of their extended family members.
Bin ich auf Fiedel geworden und du beugen. Ruhiger meine Schlafheit.
Maybe the memories of leaving their homeland would have been too painful for them to share with me. They didn't choose to leave. Their decision was made because it wasn't safe for them to remain in the old country. Anti-Semitism and pogroms targeted Jews in Eastern Europe and made life miserable for my ancestors. By 1906, thousands of Jews had been murdered. My grandparents were lucky to survive these pogroms and start a new life in America. In the summer of 2007, I decided to travel to their places of birth, now part of an independent Ukraine. My cousin Richard Collins, who grew up in Toronto and whom I've never met, joined me on this trip after we were introduced online by my sister Susan, who had met Richard years before in Toronto. Our grandfathers were brothers, and Richard had a wealth of information about the Kalinsky clan. Without his prior research and knowledge of the family history, the trip would not have been a rewarding journey. In fact, the shtetl I planned to visit was Lipovets, because this was the last place of residence for my grandfather, according to the Ellis Island immigration records. And I didn't know until I talked to Richard that the Kalinsky family actually came from a nearby shtetl of Linitz, which is now known as Alincy. Richard and I decided that it would be a great experience just to travel and tour the birthplace of our ancestors, even though we knew virtually nothing about their lives there and what they had left behind. Little did we know what we would find when we got there. Our first stop on this journey was Moscow. I visited Moscow in 1989 on an educational exchange and befriended Nikolai Lazarev and his family. Richard would join me there, and we would spend a few days getting to know each other and visiting with the Lazarev family. Richard and I had a lot in common. We were second cousins, but we developed a strong friendship almost immediately. It was very special to initiate our friendship in the motherland. Luda, Nikolai's wife, gave us the nickname Double Rick. Nikolai and his family were wonderful hosts. I knew what to expect because I lived with them for 3 weeks during my exchange. My memories of my grandmother's cooking was sour cream and bananas, and for dessert, sponge cake. She never cooked the meals that Luda cooked, not that I can remember. Nikolai and his son Ivan were very knowledgeable about American culture, especially about our music.
Until 8, she made me a good ballroom clown. Yeah. From 4 until 8, she made me a good ballroom clown. She won't do nothing but tear the nice reputation down.
Luda was very excited about our journey, and the night before we left, made a toast in our honor.
А вот, ну, за то, чтобы у них путешествие получилось, что то, зачем они едут, чтобы случилось.
So that she raises her toast to your dreams that they would come true.
Чтобы нашли свои корни. Да.
Спасибо.
Да. Чтобы удачное было путешествие.
Yes, to your trip
Thank you.
and to the success of your trip.
Thank you for having us. on
Ну,
this
я хочу
wonderful
сказать, вообще вы, ну, просто великое дело делаете. Потому что для каждой семьи это
So she
очень
said that you are doing a
важно.
very great thing, going on this trip.
Вот я вам, как говорится, по-хорошему завидую.
So
Потому
she is
что-
very jealous of you, of your relationship.
Да, да.
Поехали сами, говорит.
Yes.
Ну, может быть, там и мои корни разыщите где-нибудь.
I just
когда
hope,
приедете.
I just hope we find them.
I will always treasure my friendship with Nikolai and his family. They enjoyed meeting Richard, and I know the feelings were mutual.
Your attention please. Airport flight 183 is now ready for boarding. Passengers with children, business class passengers.
When we arrived at the Kiev airport, we were met by our driver-interpreter Maxim and his 11-year-old son Kostas. Maxim is very typical of the emerging middle class in the former Soviet Union republics. He's in his mid-30s, is on his second marriage, and owns his own business appropriately named Maxi Cars and features only Mercedes-Benz models. Maxim is also a candidate for the Grand Prix circuit, often hitting 85 miles per hour where the limit was 60, and challenging approaching vehicles while passing on treacherous two-lane highways and country roads. Richard and I favored the back seat, since that put us further away from impending doom. Nonetheless, Maxim was a wonderful guide and companion, and we enjoyed his professional services and his congenial personality. After a brief overnight stay in Kiev, we headed for the city of Vinnytsia, about 150 miles from Kiev. MapQuest indicates the trip should take about 3 3/4 hours, but Maxim got us there in 2 1/2 hours. Vinnytsia is an important industrial, cultural, and administrative center with a population of nearly 500,000 people. At the turn of the 20th century, there were about 20,000 Jews living in the city, and there were 17 synagogues. But on Rosh Hashanah in 1941, the Nazis exterminated all the Jews of Vinnytsia, as well as 28,000 Jews of neighboring shtetls. Now there is only one synagogue and an estimated Jewish population of about 3,000 that is attempting to redefine itself following the end of Soviet rule. After we checked into our modest hotel in the center of the city, we set out to find the synagogue, and much to our surprise, it was located right in the center of town, just up the street from our hotel. We were also fortunate that the chairman of the Jewish community, Isaac Novoseletsky, was in his office on the second floor of the building and was more than willing to help us in our search for information about Linitz and the Kontalinsky family, our original family name. To our surprise, he even seemed familiar with the name Kontalinsky and believed there had been a Jewish resistance fighter during the Nazi occupation with the same last name.
Кто там? Его отец был Мойша, да? Дед Мойша.
The great-grandfather was Shlomo.
Шлома. Да.
Isaac made a phone call and came back with information that Avram Kontalinsky had been a member of the Kirov partisan brigades and that he had died in 1987. We didn't take this information too seriously at the time because we knew that Richard's grandfather, also named Avram Kontalinsky, had emigrated to America in 1908 and had lived most of his adult life in Toronto. Boy, were we ever in for a surprise the next day when we got to Alincy.
Avram Kontalinsky is my grandfather.
Ну, видите?
What do you mean?
Your grandfather is...
They all came to America from
When?
Lincoln, from what he came 1908.
1908.
08. Avram Kontalinsky.
Richard and I thought that the reason the last place of residence listed on my grandfather's passport was Lipovets was possibly that his first wife, Chaya, who died soon after arriving in America, lived in Lipovets. Since it was on the way to Alinci, we decided it would be worth stopping for a visit. Before we left, I made contact with a retired English teacher, Zoya Stolchuk, who had a keen interest in local history, particularly Jewish history, although she herself was a practicing Orthodox Christian. In my correspondence through the mail, I let her know of our arrival date, but never received confirmation that she received my letter. As fate would have it, it seemed like everything on our trip was Bashert. Not only was Zoya expecting us, she had arranged for her and her friend Misha to take us on a tour of the most significant Jewish sites of Lipovets. And this was not a tour that could be offered by a travel agent or tour company because the small town has no such services. It is a backwater community of about 9,000 with virtually no Jewish population, where there had been almost 5,000 Jews in 1900. Our visit to an unmarked mass grave from World War II was almost surrealistic. There were no signs indicating the location, and there were no roads or footpaths leading there. It was like a treed oasis in the middle of a large wheat field. As we made our way through the wheat field toward the burial site, Richard recalled Kevin Costner's character walking through the cornfield in the movie Field of Dreams. But this was more like Field of Nightmares. How could such a beautiful sight with the sun shining and the golden wheat waving in the wind be the location of horrendous terror where hundreds of innocent Jews had been systematically gunned down by their Nazi murderers? We were truly overcome as we reverently stared at the overgrown mound of earth surrounded by a white picket fence that had been erected by the village. There was a modest monument on the site, but no signage or plaque to indicate what had happened there in 1942. Although neither Richard nor I are particularly observant Jews, we both felt inclined at that moment to recite the Jewish mourner's prayer, Kaddish, and place stones on the monument as an indication of our visit. When we returned to Zoya's house for lunch, she and Misha expressed concern that Jews of North America had not come forward to preserve the Jewish historical sites in Lipovets and provide the appropriate signage and recognition. We immediately thought that the posting of a plaque at the mass burial site would not be an unreasonable project for us to initiate. When we reached Alinci on Sunday, July 8th, the most we hoped to find were remnants of a synagogue and perhaps an old Jewish cemetery. In 1900, there had been about 5,000 Jews in Alinci, representing almost half the population, but by World War II, the Jewish population had shrunk to about 2,000, and virtually all these people were exterminated by the Nazis in 1942. Under Soviet rule, very little information about the shtetls in the Pale of Settlement had been published, so we were not very optimistic about finding evidence of Jewish heritage in the town. But as luck would have it, we were not in Alinci more than 5 minutes when Maxime made contact through a local cab driver with a young Jewish man named Alec Lexter, whose immediate family had escaped the Holocaust and who had returned to Alinci after the war.
3-4 families, yeah. And so there's no synagogue.
No.
What about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur? Any services, davening?
Как, или празднуют праздник Йом Кипур? Там в кругу семьи чисто.
Family, only inside of the family, not on.
Alec's parents had emigrated to Israel and his brother to Canada, but he said he chose to remain in Olincy because his wife was not Jewish, and this is where she would be most comfortable. Alec told us there were 5 Jewish families now living in Olincy, and he offered to take us to the former synagogue, which is now part of a furniture factory. Since it was Sunday, the grounds were closed, but Alec did manage to remove a lock from a basement room that once served as a Jewish school. We imagined that our grandfathers may have been students in the small, gloomy space. We never did get to see the inside of the former synagogue, but our efforts attracted the attention of a next-door neighbor, Stanislava Sikun, who informed us that the previous owner of her house was named Avram Kontalinsky, and that after he died in 1987, his second wife Fanya and their daughter Luba moved to Israel.
What was the husband's name?
Вот здесь были, так здесь он где-то похоронен.
А мы видели, что это там какой-то Каталинский или что-то.
What was her husband's name?
In this cemetery you see Katalinsky, it's husband of Fanny. Where he lived in this building.
Could this be a relative? Certainly, we would have known if there had been family in Ukraine or Israel after all these years. But then again, perhaps not. After all, when our great-grandfather Shlomo Kontalinsky passed through Ellis Island in 1913, he listed under family members remaining in Russia, none. Later, while we had lunch at Alex's home, one of his relatives informed us that Avram was buried in the Russian Orthodox cemetery in town, not the old Jewish cemetery, which had been left derelict after the war. We headed immediately for the cemetery, and what we discovered virtually stopped us in our tracks.
This is Avram Kontalinsky, who died in 1987, and his family is now, his wife and daughter are in Israel, and we don't know if he's related to the family, but we're going to try to find out. And this is not a Jewish cemetery, this is a newer cemetery where Jews and Orthodox are both buried. Our friends here think there is a resemblance to what they see in me. It certainly does look similar to from the picture on the tombstone, similar to certainly Uncle Morris Kalinsky. So we'll have to track it down. But it's quite an unexpected find and quite moving.
What followed next was a miraculous series of events that made it quite clear that the search for our family roots was truly Bashert. When we returned to Vinica, we went back to see Isaac to tell him what we had discovered, and he immediately made a phone call and passed on the following information to us. The Avram Kontalinsky, whose grave we had found, was indeed the resistance fighter Isaac had mentioned the previous day, and had survived the Holocaust by escaping from Olincy through a tunnel after the Nazis occupied the town in July of 1941. But on a sad note, Avram's first wife, Hasia, and eldest daughter, Manya, had not been so fortunate and were executed by the Nazis in a mass killing on May 24, 1942. We also learned that Avram had a daughter-in-law, Svetlana, who was still living in Vinica, and Isaac was able to contact her by phone. A visit with Svetlana was immediately arranged, and we drove directly to her home in great anticipation of meeting a lost family member face to face. We could never have been prepared for what happened next. When we arrived at Svetlana's home, we were greeted by a handsome man in his mid-40s who also bore a striking resemblance to Richard. This was Igor Kontalinsky, Svetlana's son and Avram's grandson, who now lives in Berlin but was home for a visit. Svetlana and Igor showed us pictures from their family album, and we learned the story of Avram's children who had survived the Holocaust. Svetlana's husband Dmitry had also been a member of the partisans who escaped with Avram through the tunnel and came back to Olincy after the war. He died in 2002. Avram's other children were Rosa, who died in 1990, and Grigory, who is in his 80s and now lives in Israel. By this time, we were convinced that we were related to the Kontalinsky family we had discovered in Ukraine. There was the physical similarity between Richard, Avram, and Igor, and we knew from Richard's research that the name Kontalinsky was particular to our family, having apparently been derived from an estate where the family once lived. So before we left Ukraine, we arranged with Isaac for a modest fee of $300 to hire a researcher to trace the Kontalinsky family history to try to determine how the American and Ukrainian branches of the family are related. When we returned home from our trip, Richard made contact with more Kontalinskys in Vinnytsia. Avram had a grandson, Igor, who was in Israel with his family during our visit to the Ukraine. Igor's son, Oleg, was able to communicate by email to us and provided some very important information. With Oleg's knowledge of the Kontalinsky family, and with the report of the research that we commissioned, Richard was able to put the pieces together and discover that we were indeed related to the Ukraine Kontalinskys. In all likelihood, we believe that Avram was the great-nephew of our great-grandfather Shlomo, who came to America in 1913. What an amazing journey for us. What started out as a trip just to visit our ancestral homeland turned into a wonderful experience of discovery. On the 100-year anniversary of the arrival of the Kontalinskys to America, we were able to find relatives that we never knew existed. I guess all one can say is, our journey was Bashert.